I never imagined that the line between loyalty and desire could blur so dangerously, until the night I found myself standing at my mother-in-law Martha's door, torn between my conscience and a pull I couldn't resist. What happened next would turn my world upside down forever. I had always thought of myself as a devoted husband. My wife and I had been married for 4 years, building a life together brick by brick. We didn't have children yet, but we told ourselves it was because we were waiting for the right time, financial stability, emotional readiness, all the usual reasons. Our relationship wasn't perfect, but it was solid, or so I thought. My wife was a strong-willed woman, focused and determined in everything she did. So, when she came home one evening and announced she had a week-long business trip, I didn't think twice about it. She kissed me goodbye at the train station, promising to call every evening, and just like that, I was alone for the first time in years. That's when I decided to visit Martha, my mother-in-law. She lived a couple of hours away, and I'd always enjoyed her company. Martha was the kind of woman who commanded respect effortlessly. She had a sharp mind, a warm smile, and a way of making everyone around her feel at ease. She was also strikingly beautiful, with a graceful presence that belied her age. I'd noticed it before, but I'd always pushed those thoughts aside, chalking them up to admiration. The visit started innocently enough. Martha greeted me with her usual warmth, offering a meal and asking about my wife. We spent the day running errands together, chatting about books, family, and life. She had this uncanny ability to read people, to sense what they needed before they even knew themselves. It was comforting, disarming even. That night, after a quiet dinner, Martha went to bed early, and I stayed up watching TV. But my thoughts kept wandering. The memory of her smile, the way her dress hugged her figure, the warmth in her voice, it all felt too vivid, too present. And then there was the dream. Vivid and intense, it left me shaken, unsure of where my thoughts ended and my desires began. By morning, I tried to push it all aside, convincing myself it was nothing. But the truth was harder to ignore. Something had shifted, and no matter how much I tried, I couldn't look at Martha the same way again. The following days at Martha's house felt normal on the surface, but beneath that, something unspoken lingered. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I was overthinking a harmless visit to my mother-in-law. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the way my thoughts kept drifting to her. Martha had always been warm and welcoming, but now her presence felt different. There was a subtle shift in the way she spoke to me, the way her laughter lingered a moment longer than usual. She was still the same gracious host, offering me coffee in the morning and asking about my plans for the day, but every interaction felt charged, like there was something we both weren't saying. One evening, we decided to watch a movie together. It seemed innocent enough, just two people filling the silence of an otherwise quiet night. But as the lights dimmed and the opening credits rolled, I became acutely aware of how close we were sitting on the couch. I could feel the warmth of her presence, the occasional brush of her arm against mine, and it was maddening. I found myself stealing glances at her, noticing details I shouldn't, how her hair fell softly around her face, how her lips curved when she smiled. I hated myself for it. She was my mother-in-law, for God's sake. These thoughts were wrong, shameful. And yet, the more I tried to suppress them, the stronger they became. It didn't help that Martha seemed to sense my discomfort. She had a way of reading people that was almost unnerving, and I could tell she knew something was off. "Are you okay, Andrew?" she asked one night as we sat in the kitchen, sipping tea after dinner. "Yeah," I replied too quickly, my voice faltering. "Why wouldn't I be?" She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she could see right through me. "You've just been quiet. More than usual?" I shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "Just tired, I guess." She didn't press, but the way her lips curved into a knowing smile made my stomach twist. It was as if she was daring me to admit what I couldn't even admit to myself. The turning point came late one night. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from the day, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept replaying the moments I'd shared with Martha, the way she'd laughed at my jokes, the way her hand had lingered on my arm when she passed me the salt at dinner. They were small things, insignificant on their own, but together they felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't stop putting together. I got up to get a glass of water, hoping the cool night air would clear my head. As I walked past her room, I saw the door slightly ajar, the light from her bedside lamp spilling into the hallway. Curiosity, or maybe something darker, drew me closer. Peeking inside, I saw her lying on her stomach, her hair cascading over her pillow, the soft rise and fall of her breathing almost hypnotic. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to walk away. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, torn between guilt and a pull I couldn't explain. My heart raced as I took a step closer, the floor creaking beneath my feet. She stirred but didn't wake, and for a moment, I allowed myself to take in the sight of her, vulnerable, beautiful, and completely off limits. I turned and walked back to my room, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. What was I doing? What was wrong with me? But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't deny the truth. Something was happening, something I couldn't control. And the scariest part was, I wasn't sure if I wanted to. The tension between Martha and me grew with each passing day. Every glance, every touch, every shared moment felt like a step closer to a line we both knew we shouldn't cross. Yet, the more we tried to maintain normalcy, the more impossible it became to ignore the unspoken pull between us. It started subtly. Martha would brush her hand against mine while handing me a plate, or her gaze would linger a moment too long during conversation. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but my body betrayed me. My heart would race, my skin would heat, and my thoughts would spiral into places they had no business going. One evening, as we prepared dinner together, the air between us felt thicker than usual. I stood at the counter chopping vegetables while Martha moved around the kitchen, her presence impossible to ignore. She hummed softly to herself, her movements graceful, her voice carrying a warmth that made my chest tighten. "You've been quiet today," she said, glancing over her shoulder at me. "Just tired," I replied, the same excuse I'd been using all week. She turned to face me, leaning against the counter with a curious smile. "Is that all?" Her eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I couldn't look away. The silence stretched, heavy and charged, until she finally broke it with a soft laugh. "You're a terrible liar, Andrew." I forced a smile, turning my attention back to the cutting board. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't," she said lightly, but her tone was laced with something deeper, something I couldn't ignore. That night, after dinner, Martha suggested we open a bottle of wine. "One glass won't hurt," she said with a wink, and before I could protest, she was pouring for both of us. We sat on the couch, the baby monitor on the table beside us, and the conversation flowed easily at first, light-hearted and casual. But as the wine disappeared, so did the pretense. "You've changed," she said suddenly, her voice softer now. "Since you've been here? How so?" I asked, my pulse quickening. "I don't know," she said, tilting her head as if studying me. "You seem different. Like you're carrying something heavy?" I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. "Maybe I am." She reached out, her hand resting lightly on mine. The gesture was simple, but the warmth of her touch sent a shiver down my spine. "You don't have to," she said gently. "Not with me." The moment hung between us, fragile and electric. I wanted to pull away, to put an end to whatever was happening, but I couldn't move. Instead, I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the vulnerability in her eyes, the same vulnerability I felt in myself. "Martha," I started, but the words caught in my throat. Before I could say anything else, she leaned in, her lips brushing against mine. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if she were giving me a chance to stop her. But I didn't. I couldn't. The kiss deepened, and all the guilt, the hesitation, the fear melted away, leaving only the undeniable pull between us. For a moment, nothing else existed. It was just us, two people who had crossed a line they could never uncross. But as the reality of what we'd done began to sink in, the weight of it crushed me. "I shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice trembling as she pulled away. "I'm sorry." "No," I said quickly, shaking my head. "I'm the one who—" "Don't," she interrupted, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We can't do this, Andrew. It's not right." She stood abruptly, wrapping her arms around herself as if to ward off the cold. "I think you should leave tomorrow," she said softly, her voice barely audible. This can't happen again." I wanted to argue, to tell her that it wasn't just a moment of weakness, that it meant something. But deep down, I knew she was right. What we had done was a mistake, a beautiful, intoxicating mistake, but a mistake nonetheless. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, replaying the moment over and over in my mind. Her touch, her kiss, the look in her eyes, it was all etched into my memory, impossible to forget. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the longing. I knew I couldn't stay, but the thought of leaving felt unbearable. By morning, the house was quiet. Martha didn't come to see me off, and I didn't blame her. I left a note on the kitchen table, a simple apology, though it felt inadequate. As I drove away, the weight of what had happened pressed down on me, a mix of regret and longing that I knew would haunt me for a long time to come. The days following my departure from Martha's house were a blur of emotions. Guilt, shame, longing, they all swirled inside me, leaving me restless and unable to focus. I returned home to find my wife back from her business trip, her bright smile and warm embrace a stark contrast to the storm brewing within me. I wanted to tell her everything, to confess what had happened, but the words never came. Instead, I buried it, convincing myself that silence was the only way to protect everyone involved. But secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply you try to bury them. It started with a phone call. Martha called one evening, her voice steady but her words laced with tension. "Andrew, we need to talk," she said, skipping the pleasantries. "Now?" I asked, glancing toward my wife in the kitchen. "Not now," she replied. "But soon," I agreed, my stomach twisting with dread. The conversation left me rattled, and my wife noticed. "Everything okay?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just a work thing." The next day, I made an excuse to step out and drove to a secluded spot where I could call Martha back. Her tone was calm, but her words hit like a hammer. "I can't keep this to myself, Andrew," she said. "It's eating me alive." I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. "Martha, we agreed." "I know what we agreed," she interrupted. "But it's not that simple. This secret, it's too big." "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But I can't pretend like nothing happened. Not anymore." Her words haunted me for days. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. The guilt was unbearable, but so was the fear of losing everything. I knew Martha was right, the weight of our actions was too heavy to carry alone. But the thought of telling my wife the truth, of watching her face crumble as she realized the betrayal, was too much to bear. And then the inevitable happened. One evening, while my wife and I were having dinner, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, her expression shifting as she read the message. "It's my mom," she said, her tone unreadable. "What did she say?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "She wants to talk," she replied, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at me. "About something important?" My heart sank. I could feel the blood drain from my face as I forced a smile. "I'm sure it's nothing," I said, but the words felt hollow. That weekend, my wife decided to visit Martha. I stayed behind, claiming work obligations, but the truth was, I couldn't face her. I spent the entire day pacing the house, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. By the time my wife returned, the tension in the air was palpable. She didn't say anything at first, just set her bag down and walked past me into the living room. "How was your visit?" I asked, my voice strained. She turned to face me, her expression cold and unreadable. "Interesting," she said, crossing her arms. I felt my chest tighten. "What do you mean?" She studied me for a moment, her gaze piercing. "Is there something you want to tell me, Andrew?" My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to find the words. I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she took a step closer. "Don't lie to me," she said, her voice low but filled with a quiet fury. "I talked to my mom." "I know." The room seemed to tilt, and I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself. "I can explain," I began, but she cut me off. "Explain," she said, her voice rising. "Explain what, Andrew? That you betrayed me? That you couldn't keep your hands off my mother?" Tears welled in her eyes, and her voice broke. "How could you do this to me? To us?" "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It was a mistake?" "A mistake," she repeated, her tone incredulous. "Sleeping with my mother is a mistake?" I tried to reach for her, but she stepped back, her eyes blazing with anger and pain. "Don't touch me," she said sharply. "I can't even look at you right now." She turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I stood there, numb, as the reality of what had just happened sank in. The secret was out, and there was no undoing it. The days that followed were a nightmare. My wife refused to speak to me, and the silence was suffocating. I reached out to Martha, desperate for some kind of clarity, but she was distant, her guilt as heavy as mine. Eventually, my wife packed a bag and left. She didn't say where she was going or if she'd be back. All she left behind was a note, scrawled in shaky handwriting, "I need time. Don't contact me." I was alone, left to sit with the wreckage of my choices. The house felt empty, the walls closing in around me. I replayed every moment, every decision that had led to this point, and all I could feel was regret. Martha and I didn't speak again. Whatever connection we'd shared had been shattered, replaced by an unspoken understanding that we could never go back. I lost everything, my wife, my home, my sense of self, all because I had given in to a moment of weakness. In the end, the truth came out, as it always does. And while it was devastating, it was also a lesson, a painful reminder that some lines, once crossed, can never be undone. The fallout of my actions was more devastating than I could have ever imagined. After my wife left, the house felt like a tomb, filled with nothing but the echoes of what once was. The silence was unbearable, and the weight of my guilt pressed down on me like a physical burden. Each day felt like a punishment, a reminder of the trust one had shattered and the people I had hurt. At first, I tried to reach out to my wife. I called, I texted, I even drove to her workplace, but she wouldn't see me. Her silence was louder than any words she could have spoken, and it cut deeper than any argument ever could. She didn't just leave me, she disappeared from my life entirely, taking with her the possibility of forgiveness. Martha, too, retreated into her own world. I tried to talk to her, to make sense of what had happened between us, but she wouldn't engage. Her guilt mirrored my own, and every interaction was steeped in awkwardness and shame. We were two people bound by a mistake too heavy to carry, and the strain was evident. I stopped reaching out after a while, realizing that there was nothing left to say. The family dynamic was irreparably broken. Word of my wife's departure spread quickly, though the details remained a mystery to everyone but us. Family gatherings became tense and sparse, with people whispering behind my back and throwing me looks of pity or disdain. Martha stopped attending altogether, and I couldn't blame her. The few times we were in the same room, the tension was unbearable, the unspoken truth hanging between us like a dark cloud. I tried to move on, to rebuild some semblance of a life, but the weight of my actions made it nearly impossible. I threw myself into work, hoping to drown out the noise in my head, but even that offered little solace. Every moment of quiet brought the memories rushing back, Martha's touch, my wife's tears, the sound of the door slamming shut as she left. Eventually, I sought therapy, desperate to make sense of the chaos I had created. Sitting in that room, I was forced to confront the ugly truths I had spent months avoiding. I talked about my marriage, my wife's absence, and the forbidden connection with Martha. It was painful, but it was necessary. For the first time, I began to see the patterns that had led me to this point, the insecurity, the need for validation, the way I had allowed myself to blur the lines of right and wrong. Therapy didn't fix everything, but it gave me the tools to start putting the pieces of my life back together. I learned to sit with my guilt without letting it consume me, to take responsibility for my actions without being defined by them. Slowly, I began to rebuild, not the life I had before, but something new, something more honest. Months turned into a year, and the sharp edges of the pain began to soften. My wife still hadn't returned, and I had stopped hoping she would. She deserved better than what I had given her, and I had to accept that she might never forgive me. I wrote her a letter, not to win her back, but to apologize. I told her the truth about everything, about how much I regretted the choices I had made and the pain I had caused. I didn't expect a response, and I didn't get one, but writing it felt like a step toward closure. As for Martha, I never saw her again. Whatever connection we had shared was too tainted to salvage. She moved away shortly after everything came to light, and though I heard bits and pieces about her from mutual friends, I never reached out. It was better that way, for both of us. The hardest part of the fallout was accepting that there was no way to undo what had been done. The relationships I had destroyed couldn't be mended, and the trust one had broken couldn't be restored. But I could move forward. I could learn from my mistakes and try to become a better person, not for anyone else, but for myself. I started volunteering at a local shelter, using my free time to give back to the community. It wasn't penance, exactly, but it felt like a way to channel my energy into something positive. Helping others reminded me that life goes on, even after you've made the worst mistakes imaginable. In the end, the consequences of my actions were permanent, but they weren't the end of my story. I lost my marriage, my family, and a part of myself, but I also gained something, clarity. I saw my flaws for what they were, and I found the strength to confront them. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start. The fallout taught me a lesson I'll carry for the rest of my life. Trust is fragile, and once it's broken, it can't always be repaired. Love isn't enough to erase betrayal, and sometimes, the only way to move forward is to let go of the past. A year after everything fell apart, I found myself standing on the other side of the chaos, scarred but still standing. The life I had before was gone, but in its place, I had built something quieter, steadier, and more honest. The journey to get here wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The first lesson I learned was that love, no matter how deep, cannot excuse betrayal. I had allowed myself to blur the lines between admiration and desire, convincing myself that fleeting moments of connection justified crossing boundaries. But the truth is, nothing justifies breaking the trust of those who love you. My wife had trusted me to be her partner, and I had failed her in the worst way. That trust wasn't something I could rebuild, it was something I had to learn to live without. Martha was a reminder of another lesson, that vulnerability can be dangerous if left unchecked. She and I had both been in fragile places, and instead of leaning away from temptation, we had leaned into it. The connection we shared, however intense, was built on the wrong foundation. It wasn't love, it was loneliness, a desire to feel seen and valued. And while it may have felt real in the moment, it came at too great a cost. The months after my wife left were a time of reckoning. Therapy forced me to face the truths I had avoided for so long, my inability to set boundaries, my need for validation, and my tendency to seek comfort in the wrong places. These were painful realizations, but they were also liberating. For the first time, I saw myself clearly, not as a victim of circumstance, but as the architect of my own downfall. Forgiveness became another part of the process, though not in the way I expected. I had to learn to forgive myself, not to excuse what I had done, but to free myself from the weight of my guilt. Holding on to that guilt wouldn't undo the past, it would only keep me trapped in it. By forgiving myself, I found the strength to move forward, even if I didn't deserve a second chance. One day, while walking through the park, I saw a father playing with his young daughter. The sight stopped me in my tracks, a bittersweet reminder of the life I had dreamed of with my wife. I thought of the family we might have built, the future we might have shared, and the mistakes that had taken it all away. But instead of despair, I felt something else: acceptance. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could change what I did next. I could choose to live with integrity, to be honest with myself and others, and to build a life rooted in the values I had once taken for granted. I began volunteering regularly, pouring my energy into helping others. It wasn't penance, exactly, but it was a way to give back, to find purpose in the wake of my mistakes. As for my wife, I never heard from her again. The letter I had written, apologizing for everything, remained unanswered. I understood her silence. She didn't know me forgiveness, and I didn't expect it. But I hoped, wherever she was, that she had found happiness, that she had built a life free of the shadows I had cast. Martha's absence was another reminder of the consequences of our actions. She had moved on, and so had I, though the memory of what happened between us would always linger. It was a chapter in my life I couldn't erase, but it was one I had learned to close. In the end, I learned that redemption isn't about erasing the past, it's about facing it, learning from it, and doing better. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild, and some relationships can't survive the weight of betrayal. But life goes on, and with it comes the opportunity to grow, to change, and to find meaning in the lessons we've learned. I still carry the scars of my mistakes, but they no longer define me. They are a part of my story, a reminder of where I've been and how far I've come. And though I'll never forget what I lost, I found peace in knowing that I've become stronger because of it. What would you do if faced with a choice that could shatter everything you've built? Share your thoughts in the comments, I'd love to hear your perspective. If this story resonated with you or made you think, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are more real and raw stories coming, each one more shocking than the last. Turn on notifications so you don't miss a thing.